Hello everyone, today we talk about the First Punic War at sea and more specifically reconstruct the Battle of Cape Eknomos, close to today's Licata in Sicily, through the Polybian account that is the essentially what the tactical reconstruction is based on, and that depicts a pretty interesting clash, a sort of failed Carthaginian cannae at sea. It's difficult to draw a parallelism with Hannibal in the later century, but the tactical concepts definitely were around. Naval warfare worked differently. We are gradually covering this for the actually few great naval battles of antiquity, if you count them, not just compared to terrestrial warfare, to the major terrestrial engagements, but in general, just from a chronological point of view. The commanders involved, we will see now from the Roman side, it's Marcus Atilius Regulus, Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus. From the Punic side, we find Hanno, Hamilcar. The Carthaginians had even less fantasy than the Romans in onomastics. Nevertheless, this is one of the rare, in fact, first Schwerpunkt videos about not just the First Punic War, but the Punic Wars in general. I'm actually preparing some content, creating also images for the Manipular army and others of the around the same period because of the incredible scarcity of Creative Commons. I use it just basically Creative Commons images for the copyright issues, and for some topics there is an abundance of imagery for one of the most important armies in the history of mankind. There is very, very few. Nevertheless, we shall start discussing this in a broader sense. I already covered some aspects of the Second Punic War. I think never discussed really the first. It may be the very first video about it. Nevertheless, this has a naval cut, which definitely for the First Punic War is crucial, arguably more important than the second, when the Romans were actually hegemonic, and so they didn't really face much threat from Carthage that wouldn't even help Hannibal, even when he had seized Sicily, and when, generally speaking, things were going, successfully to an extent in Italy. The First Punic War was the moment in which that Roman hegemony was established, right? And through a very long series of operations, of engagements, and also moments of stasis where you find both the Romans and you would think in perspective also worse the Carthaginians that were initially the masters of the sea, if anything, by the maritime culture of their republic, rotting away for reasons that we can't simply investigate. In any case, this war and the Battle of Cape Eknomos, that is quite indicative, in fact, of the whole conflict, definitely affirmed the Roman superiority at sea, right? This is one of the greatest moments in the history of mankind, not just because Rome basically opened herself to this Hellenic South. It's from the wars of this generation that the Latin literature itself is born in a, say, more narrowly literary sense. The Romans met this great rich world of the South that they began to take control on it, also in many technical ways that were had been at least left aside before. For example, I made a video about the Gastrafetes and early artillery in general, and we've seen how actually the first time we know of some actual artillery being employed is in a Roman army, right? In the clashes still between the Italics, for which of course there had been some Hellenic engineers operating it, but this well before Alexander. And the entire Hellenistic tradition sort of made it boom. So it's not like the Romans did not know, for example, such technologies originally, but they wouldn't need them until they began to invade this, say, largely urbanized and maritime south as well, that in fact required a great naval force that the Romans had basically never had. Up to this point, there had been some ill-fated attempts to invade Sardinia. Of course, Rome had a powerful fleet, but basically, the story goes, at least the Romans were there's a very underrated and misunderstood aspect, that all the times we hear of the Romans essentially, as the Vulgata says, copied. This is a very modernistic hallucination, by the way. Other people's technologies, allegedly, as if, by the way, Rome or the Italic background did not have any. This essentially allowed them to prevail over their enemies. If anything, during the First Punic War, we do see Rome developing this incredibly effective naval culture, manages to beat the greatest sailors around in Carthage. But that evidently shows how, by that point, like in the moment in which you are able to absorb a technology, to develop it, and to even beat through it, at least, not necessarily with it, because the Romans were, say, a might exactly for what went beyond the strictly material side of the story. And so beating the enemy, essentially what he knows best, it means you are already more advanced than it. So, for example, the Romans wouldn't have large parks of artillery until the Second Punic War, when Scipio, and not yet Africanus, had seizes basically Cartagena, Cartagonova in Spain, where there were an enormous amount of these catapults and other siege machinery. The Carthaginians is that they were much more sort of Hellenistic in mentality and in material culture, had somehow developed on their own, even though, strangely enough, during the Second Punic War, Hannibal didn't seem to. He was, of course, a genius of a hell of a general, to say the least, one of the greatest in the history of mankind, but does not appear to have made a great use of artillery. In part because there were also difficulties to find the actual pieces. If you don't have Asian woman's hair, you can't really have a torsion catapult, guys. That's how things in antiquity literally work and materially work like. It's also a myth that Hannibal could take Rome after Cannae. That's just something, again, people echo from, the famous thing of Marble that said that but we know, factually, historically speaking, that was not feasible, and that would have ended in disaster, by the way. There was still a chance to curb the Romans until the Battle of Metaurus, but it's not by technical means that the Carthaginians even lacked at that point to besiege such a large city so far from home, and without actual even help from their motherland. Let's not digress too much on this, but just be aware that what you see here at work, so during the First Punic War, is an enormous amount of moral forces from both sides, by the way, because the efforts here are really insane. There is some legitimate criticism of Polybius' accounts, especially in terms of the types of ships that we'll see now, and the size of the crews and the total troops put at sea, because some of these were invasion forces, as we'll see now, like at Eknomos, and that would make the armies of insane dimension. We, of course, know that it wasn't like that. In any case, the tactical narrative is pretty plausible and very, very interesting. We will simply read Polybius and analyze it. Very simple. As you know, Polybius' mind is of a shocking modernity. It seems like just reading a person from today, right? So we are, in that sense, children of the Greeks, intellectually in many ways. However, a bit of introduction to the First Punic War, which definitely marks, talking mostly naval warfare here, so we're not discussing armies or other. We'll talk briefly later about Xanthippus, because that's yet another thing that people usually get blow up out of proportion, mostly because of the Spartan connection, etc. First Punic War definitely marks the transfer of control over the Western Mediterranean from the Carthaginians to the ascendant Rome, right? This war indeed represents the significant naval endeavor undertaken by the Romans against their Punic opponents, and deserves therefore such enormous strategic attention. The war was particularly long. It lasted notoriously 20 years. Actually, the Romans could win it pretty quickly. Then it's, as you know, Regulus that messes things up and ruins the entire. Carthage could be, say, knocked out this earlier in time. There would have not even been a second Punic War. Maybe there would have been, because the Romans would have not literally destroyed the city like in the third and, in fact, final war. That hadn't happened even during the second, but the Carthaginians would have been quite earlier, much earlier degraded to a secondary power in that case. And this would bring, in fact, to a lot of, say, dragging also of the sea warfare in the following years, without any major conclusive action, except the important loss of the island of Sicily by the Carthaginians that at a point simply sit there and nobody really understands why, if anything, such mistakes are made. If you are dispirited, that there are political issues that prevent you from doing it, that you let prevent you from going past them. And it is, in this sense, somewhat even surprising, given that the primary theater of war was Sicily, how, we were recalling it before, both sides allowed their fleets to deteriorate at various stages, and so not resuming the initiative with what would have crucially been, like for all the sieges, critically the one of Lilybaeum, the most important Carthaginian center on the island, to, in fact, prevent the sea blockade, which is effectively how you can hope to take a city port to begin with. If you do not have that superiority at sea, the enemy can simply resupply the center. It's not simply about that. There's still a ratio of forces that can lean still in favor of the besiegers. But we've seen it also in other wars between the Carthaginians and the Greeks, how crucial, of course, the presence of a fleet was. I made a video about the siege of Motia, for example. We talked about other land battles of the Puno-Hellenic wars in the island. Now, the objective of the First Punic War was for both contendants to gain control of the island of Sicily, which was, of course, a disproportionately wealthy, advanced, but also in this sense politically decadent and fragmented, in fact, center mostly of grain supplies, right? That would be crucial to supply the same Romans historically for a long time to come, also throughout even part at the beginning of the Middle Ages. We talked about this, so such granary had been heavily contended, in fact, by the Greeks and the Carthaginians already. In fact, those were the main protagonists of all the previous period. The island was effectively divided between them. Carthage was a unitary power, the Greeks weren't, but on the longer run, Syracuse had been hegemonizing the Hellenic component of the island. Some Greeks sided with the Carthaginians, depending, but because there were so many different cities, considered that Syracuse was the greatest Hellenic power at a point, even more than Sparta and Athens. And it was not in Greece, but in Sicily. And that gives you alone a dimension of the Hellenic colonization of the island, and more, because of course these were also slightly different governments from the ones of the Hellenic motherland. We'll talk about Pyrrhus soon too, so that actually is a bit like the prelude, to the First Punic War, but I do think it's not necessarily in chronological order. These are two different contents. They intertwine, admittedly, but that's not, again, the consequential order that we follow here. But of Taras, the other Hellenic polis of what the Romans called the Magna Graecia, that is to say, the Great Greece, right? And that, in fact, was the name attributed to this entire southern Italian, Sicilian, Hellenic, mostly coastland, because that's essentially where just the Hellenic presence lay. There were other peoples in the interland that were a bit more primitive, but they were really relatively unscathed by the Hellenic ways of war. If anything, it was more like the Greeks that were influenced by the interland peoples, and this is true for many other parts of the Hellenically colonized Mediterranean. I made a video explaining how and why civilizations like the Etruscans and the Romans never actually had any single trace of any trace, and I can't stress this enough, of any form whatsoever of hoplitic warfare ever, right? There wasn't anything of that. Wearing an hoplitic panoply has nothing to do with fighting with the type of Hellenic phalanx that we think also to have, which is, there is all this recent videos, other channels tend to copy each other about the Hellenic heresy, this deep academic problem. There is no need to invent such an issue that it's mostly like a mental, better I don't say what, within a decadent academia, to have studied the battles and campaigns of Hellenic warfare and the ones of other peoples, and understanding what the differences are. So I think that those are much more interesting things to discuss than scholarly problems, but unfortunately half of the West is utterly obsessed in a self-referential way exclusively with scholarship, and they don't even study sources anymore. That's sadly been the case for too long. Nevertheless, the Greeks, with the main center of Syracuse, as you know, had occupied mostly the southeastern part of the island, which is sort of a triangle. And the Carthaginians, the western part, for at that point straightforward geographical reasons. Geopolitics does not exist. It's a complete farce for the mentally feeble, but of course geography is also a factor among the others, and definitely not the decisive one. And then there is the northeastern corner of Sicily, the one with the most important cities, Messina, that controls the straits. And these were also other Hellenic city-states with this Sicilian, but it was essentially italicized interland. We will look at this also because of the casus belli that at least drew Rome into the local disputes that, as you know, had to do with these warbanders, Italic mercenaries, the Mamertines, after Mamers, that was in fact the Oscan name for Mars. We should make more videos about the Italic warbands, and especially the connection with Mars, because the Romans had the same thing up to very late in time, telling the truth. Look at the incision to Publius Valerius Publicola, what his comrades in arms wrote for him. The Mamertines are a very interesting topic. We shall definitely talk more about these Italic war bands also across the Mediterranean, because nobody talks about them for some reason. At least I will not digress on this, but they constituted a quite relevant component. For example, the Epirot army at a point, also the same Carthaginian, especially during the Second Punic War. As you know, at Zama there were many Italics that got themselves killed against the ones of the Roman side as well. The Mamertines had created this state, this predatory sort of piratical mercenary state, in northeastern Sicily, they had actually been beaten by both the Carthaginians and the Syracusan. They hadn't been able, these opponents hadn't been able to extirpate them from the island. That's the moment in which the Romans get involved. They were a bit embarrassed because the Mamertines had basically killed everybody when they had taken Messina. It was they were pretty nasty individuals in many ways, but that was a very good occasion to prove that, of course, Rome was inherently superior to both the Greeks and the Carthaginians. And so the Urbs takes this major step in her history to cross the strait into Sicily, which is not Italy. Like, as far as the Romans went, like central, southern Italy was basically Italic, and so the Romans, the Latins, sort of familiarized us with the Oscans that they gradually subjugated, as you know, after terrifying wars, including the Samnitic one. In fact, the Mamertines were, in a sense, the product of this Roman expansionism that had conquered and sort of pacified with massive and ruthless authority and adherence the Italian interland. And there was all a policy, if you know Roman history very well aware of, let's say, of the senatorial oligarchy that here before Cannae is also pretty alive in that sort of older Mars in an incredibly rigidly violent way, that propagated mostly like the necessity of a continental expansion, like the latifundium. They were adverse to the third estate, the merchants, those who wanted instead to expand at sea, and that in hindsight, like, of course, the Romans eventually followed, but still by, of course, a strong senatorial guidance, the one that, of course, brought Rome properly to empire, because that's when the Romans, after the First Punic War, they create provinces. So they rule over foreign lands, as opposed to these brothers / cousins of the Italic background. That's also a reason why the Oscan connection, say the Italic connection, brings the Romans to Sicily. All right, the Mamertines were a symbol of that. Right, if Rome could essentially respond to their call, she could also show that she was really from the side of a broader Italic world. Against these foreigners that were technically foreigners. Again, I will not digress on the story of the Indo-European migrations, also in the Sicilian interland, how de facto we're discovering that, yes, they were sort of, at least in the way we branch the Indo-European families, sort of kind of Italics. We've seen it for the Ligurians, we've seen it for peoples that we do not have the ultimate proof of being this or that. It's in an explicit sense, but that we understand historically, archaeologically, and also linguistically for what we know to have been in that same branch. Of course, the Romans had been eyeing Sicily from quite a long time. Pyrrhus, by leaving Italy, said, "Oh my God, what a leaving Sicily specifically said, what a battlefield I left for the Romans and the Carthaginians to fight over." And that's exactly, in fact, what happened. And so Rome was already looking forward to expand her influence over Sicily, and for this reason set out to build the fleet to achieve this aim, because, as we explained before, without that naval power, there was no way to contend the island, wrestle it, and stripping it from the Carthaginians. This decision immediately posed a direct challenge to the Carthaginian navy, because aside from some attempted secrecy, of course, if you build a large fleet, everybody knows that, right? There is not a way to hide it in any way. The Punics had at this point approximately 200 quinqueremes. We will talk about these ships, that I talk about the ship's types in detail with all the technical data categorized and articulated. So just wait, we'll get to that, I have already an ancient naval warfare playlist. I'm creating many others for your ease, right, of research. This Carthaginian fleet of approximately 200 quinqueremes was crewed by, of course, a people with a long and distinguished tradition of seafaring. I made a video about the Phoenician bireme of roughly slightly less of half of a millennium before. Not too much had changed at sea. Actually, a big deal had, in perspective, like to the relative times and places and technical capacities. The quinqueremes here, for example, are the protagonists of the story, because the trireme already, by the major navies at least of the Mediterranean, had been started to be gradually surpassed. The Romans initially possessed a modest fleet of around 20 triremes. Yet they managed, making the coastal populations of the peninsula under their control working very hard, to subsequently construct a battle fleet comprising 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes. The technical divides were practically non-existent, aside from the fact that the Romans implemented notoriously their ships with the corvus, this essentially hooked assault deck, mobile deck, the assault deck that you can swing. There is actually a huge controversy about whether the corvus existed, whether it was such a resolutory thing. Indeed, it's quite complicated to use it, and it's sort of doubtful that the Romans would have simply come out with like a technology and innovation that ipso facto managed to solve sort of war at sea from their side. So I will talk more about this in another video. Of course, the Romans, however, it's what I was saying before, they actually beat the Carthaginians fair and square at something that these people had been the best at, right, without the needs of the corvus per se. Boarding was normally practiced just as a completely conventional and so-called symmetric way of war from quite a long time, from the dawn of naval warfare. As a matter of fact, like, the Romans would have not been defective in that either, and it's been pointed out that the Romans would have had sort of more aggressive marines that were essentially the same legionnaires. I also made a video about this topic, the so-called milites classiarii, so the militaries of the fleet, even though that was an early imperial, at the earliest late Republican themed video. But again, the essentials were actually the same. In fact, is true also for the Carthaginians. The differences were not huge. Moral forces are important, and that leadership as well, etc. We will see it in the Battle of Cape Ecnomus. It's also notorious, as yet another anecdote, that next to the one of the corvus, for example, that the Romans used to build this fleet almost from scratch, at least in order to be able to face the Carthaginian one. In fact, the same captured Carthaginian. Actually, the anecdote says one captured Carthaginian vessel as their model. Naturally, there would have been plenty of ways to replicate one. But the Romans, in their later historiography, were, and I sort of interrupted myself with all these digressions, but I was talking about that before, introduced later in their time, say in the late Republic, when they had basically taken over already the entire Hellenistic world, in this sense that the Romans had somehow innovated and implemented on the Hellenistic achievements. So buying a bit also slightly in that level of Hellenic technologism, which was never sort of an integrating part of the true sort of Latin culture, the Romans remained always much more, say, rough, but also concrete in many ways. And that's part of the reason why there are lots of people also that, for some perverted reason, dislike Rome, that babble like it is that Rome copied everything, and they don't know that it's a sort of propagandistic piece that the Romans built ex post, just to glorify themselves in the face of the Greeks, to trigger them in part, and that it has actually not much to do with the actual moral superiority that, in fact, is the main reason why they surpassed their enemies during the conquest of the world. Now, at the time of the First Punic War, when shipbuilding was reliant on the individual experiences of shipwrights rather than detailed plans on paper, better say parchment, they must have had some vessel for the carpenters to emulate. This is for sure. Nevertheless, it cannot have been necessarily even just a typical Punic ship, as Roman vessels were consistently, at least were reputed, consistently slower and heavier than their Carthaginian counterparts, which was actually not even a problem. Like, of course, you lose in maneuverability, it can be threatening, but at the same time, you are bulkier, also more straightforwardly aggressive and sturdy fighter on water, and so even if surely also later the Romans copied, captured, at least took as a model, captured Carthaginian ships, the knowledge, the skills, the secrets, the wisdoms regarding shipbuilding, naval warfare, etc., were pretty much shared all across the Mediterranean. If anything, if there had been any mental limit, the Romans showed to be able to simply surpass it also in a much more pragmatic way, like it was typical of their culture. There's a bit this myth, like if we saw it in the analysis of the Battle of Kynoskephali, we'll see it because it's Saint Polybius that talks about that for the Battle of Cape Eknomos, that the Romans were sort of more valiant and the Carthaginians preferred maneuvering and or evolutions. They're a bit of a literary embellishment. These battles were quite crudely fought and quite closely, as well, as we'll see in the case of Cape Eknomos. Again, it's incredibly similar to the Battle of Cannae on water. The Romans prepared thus their forces, and in 260 BC they set off for Sicily to engage the Carthaginians. They possessed one significant tactical surprise in the aforementioned form of the corvus. I will not describe this, if not in those videos. Look at the single ship types and so on. And if anything, yes, the Romans would have tried especially to gap any sort of deficit they may have had at maritime skills of navigation by having this incredibly violent and brutal marines. I could not stress enough how radically primitive the Romans still were at this point under any point of view, in the good sense of the term, right? They were actually very advanced already as a civilization because of an incredible level of literacy. We tend to give, let's say, sort of the Romans, like to emphasize certain aspects of them as if they were a copy of the Greeks, and or sort of stress that their primitivity and brutality would have come to being sort of, if not cavemen or some incredibly otherwise technically unskilled people. That's not the point, right? They were already something in an excellent mix between tradition and modernity, which makes always the finest civilization skyrocket in history and expand and conquering other peoples. Legionaries were thus especially well suited for marine duties, especially their flexible individual fighting tactics were ideal for combat aboard ships. Always remember that even though at this point the Romans have already fully developed not just the Livian legion, but say it would be actually the same, the so-called Polybian one. That's also why I'm preparing some videos about the Manipular Legion, because it's basically the same. We call it Livian from the end of the where the last 2 decades of the 4th century BC, because Livy describes it for the first time, and then we say we as a fully developed Manipular Legion. Then Polybius describes it for the later times, mostly the Second Punic War, when this system reaches its full tactical maturity. And so the phase here of traumatically transforming the incredibly brutal Italic warrior into a rigidly disciplined Roman legionnaire had already happened. But as you know, throughout all legionary history, the Romans were not great because they had annihilated the individual bias of their fighters. If anything, they had reached also in this case this perfect balance between, of course, prevalent collective training with a shocking discipline and something really monstrous in the way it was just achieved, but also, and very importantly, that individual aggressiveness that had characterized their civilization since the beginning. I mean, a true Roman was a person who killed lots of people with his own hands, chopping them to pieces. This is the ideal of the Roman in these centuries, especially in the 4th century BC. That's the moment we've seen, like, basically Rome was constantly at war. It had, as a meat grinder, as a steamroller, basically massacred anyone who had gotten her way with an incredible, say, crystal clear view of the fact that the only purpose that Rome had was conquering the universe entire and molded in her own image, as the Romans were God's chosen people. And so there is, some difficulty in, making them change their ideas. And so when they would board these Punic ships, they would go full, mode, especially in this fact tactics that, as you know, in boarding are much more individual, unleashing that quasi, sadistic taste for blood that Rome really had since the very beginning of her foundation, as the very foundation of the sacrificial, the spoliopima to God himself. Now, despite the loss of several ships in an initial skirmish, we will not look in, of course, in detail like the entire First Punic War at sea, but we have to at least refer what was going on. The Romans encountered 130 Punic ships at Mylae. This is today's Milan, so this is close to the Strait of Messina, so actually pretty close to the area that the Romans considered basically their own already. The Roman commander was the famous consul Caius Duilius. There was a famous Victorian-era Italian ironclad class that notoriously paralyzed the entire world navies, because at that point in history it was basically not even the Royal Navy had the means to actually compete with that, and it was in honor of this commander. The Carthaginians were led instead by one of the numerous Hannibals in Punic history that we know also very few of, usually just from these, in fact, Hellenic accounts of the wars between, in fact, the Greeks and the Romans against the Punics. Now, the Carthaginians, on that occasion, launched a bold attack, but suffered the loss of 50 ships to the Roman borders before retreating. So the Romans really showed that aforementioned attitude to their novel competitors. Among their losses was the same Hannibal's flagship, a vessel captured from Pyrrhus, of Epirus, that had, in fact, as you know, invaded southern Italy, Sicily, and had actually scored remarkable success. His plan was to create this Western dominion to eventually start from the east and reconquer everything that Alexander had conquered. Unfortunately, for at least our entertainment, the thing did not happen, because his life was cut short, as he just parted. But we will talk about the guy again soon, as I was saying. Hannibal, the admiral himself, narrowly escaped by taking to the ships both, and this is really ominous. I mean, if this is the first serious engagement, evidently the Carthaginians do have a problem. Hannibal might have fared better in Roman custody, for in the following year he was once again defeated by the Romans in Sardinian waters, and his subordinates expressed their dissatisfaction in the customary manner by crucifying him, which is something typical in Carthage for the failing generals by decision of the Punic Senate, right? Formally, like we call, in fact, both Carthage and Rome at this point republics, as you know, also from Polybius, the famous comparison of the two, the fact that, at least in theory, the systems had been, at least the cities had been founded at essentially just a generation from distance from one another, and they sort of peaked in different times. And Polybius makes the famous point that, of course, during the Second Punic War, Rome had topped basically every sort of political, military, and social balance. Following the Battle of Mylae, there was little naval activity for a duration of 2 years. Then in 257 BC, a small skirmish took place, in which both sides believed they had gained the upper hand, which definitely indicates some struggle from the Punic side, at least, and the Romans, of course, having to check their cards at the moment. But this brought to the actual conviction that they could take an extra step, make a bit of a greater effort in settling the matter. This is basically how the Battle of Cape Ecnomus came about. So both parties resolved to make a significant attack in the year of 256. The Roman plan was to launch an invasion of Carthaginian territory. And for doing this, of course, you have to reach Africa, you have to circumvent the unconquered portion of Sicily as well. They will pass to the south. In fact, that's where Mount Eknomos is, in southern Sicily, again, near to Licata. I think the location is, to be precise, well, yes, it's not, of course, we do not have the exact GPS, but say that's basically it. There is a town where we think that it happened in front, but say this is speculative to a degree. In any case, this fleet of, Polybius says, 330 cataphract ships. I will not digress now on this. It's, it can mean different things, but it's not so important. Like the Romans had, as we've seen, bulkier ships, and that's more or less what we mean. For the rest, the means were very conventional. The Carthaginians would have had something similar, and just the class of ship was pretty much the same as we've seen, the quinquereme, the trireme. Mount Eknomos was the rendezvous for the army and the fleet. Naturally, there are all land operations that are taking place in Sicily that are quite interesting, but we're looking just at the naval side of the story. And so that's where essentially the Romans embarked their forces. Remember that fleets essentially throughout like the entire ancient medieval history are primarily have primarily subsidiary function to support land armies, right? They have to supply them, they have to facilitate transportation. Very often they just follow the army on land by coastal navigation. That is essentially almost all they do. The Romans actually, they made a video about this. They lost at some point an important amount of ships. We will see it happened in Sicily, but it happened also in an ill-fated crossing from Sicily to, I don't remember what it was, Campania or Latium itself. Nevertheless, these things did happen. You could save time in a way, but the main military function of the ships is to attack other fleets that are, in that sense, endangering supply lines of the land armies. And or they're actually shipping, like in this case, armies across the sea, because that's, there is a strait between Africa and Sicily, and definitely they couldn't just swim it through. Now, according to Polybius, the Carthaginians possessed no fewer than 350 ships. In any case, it's a mastodontic effort from both sides. So, again, we do not know better about other figures. We have to go with what the source gives us. This definitely is an exceptional effort. The usual muster count was around 200. And so this fleet made its way to the southern coast of Sicily, positioning itself to intercept the Roman invasion fleet. Of course, seeking for the major confrontation. It's a bit like siege warfare, right? All great battles at the time are essentially fought over the siege of a settlement that an army uses also as a bait for the enemy to come try to force the block, and or like seizing the settlement with all the strategic advantage that comes from that. In this time in history, there was no such technology. This would be achieved only in Victorian times to, for example, intercept fleets in a wide stretch of sea, like it can be, I don't know, the Channel of Sicily, in fact. So basically, in galley warfare, what you do, it's not even just a galley, it's something that continues also later, is just stationing. Just with all, there are runners, there are vessels that bring news, etc. Again, everything is very permeable, and this enormous fleet is known before it's known before you can see it, of course. And the Romans are descending the Sicilian coast, so they're obviously passing to the south, reaching somewhere. Then, if they want to give battle or not, this is not the point. But if they're making that hell of a fort, it's for that major purpose. And of course, the Carthaginians know that the Romans can land in Tunisia, what the Romans called Africa, in fact, and that Carthage herself can and will be threatened if the Roman invasion fleet is not destroyed. So that's how the Battle of Eknomos happens. It clearly illustrates the typical tactics employed by both fleets, and is noteworthy for the elaborate plans devised by the opposing admirals. And that's when I will pass to Polybius directly. So we are Polybius. The history is, of course, Book 1, Chapter 25 and following. So this is the Battle of Cape Eknomos. Ecnomus in Latin, if you prefer. It's, So next year, this talks about the Battle of Sardinia. It says, next year Gaius Atilius, the consul, happened to be at anchor off Tyndaris when he observed the Carthaginian fleet sailing by in a straggling manner. He passed the word to the crews of his own ships to follow the advanced squadron, and started himself before the rest with 10 ships of equal sailing powers. When the Carthaginians became aware that while some of the enemy were still embarking, others were already putting out to sea, and that the advanced squadron were considerably ahead of the rest, they stood round and went to meet them. They succeeded in surrounding and destroying all of them except the consul's ship, and that they all but captured with its crew. This last, however, by the perfection of its rowers and its consequent speed, effected a desperate escape. Meanwhile, the remaining ships of the Romans were sailing up and gradually drawing close together. Having got into line, they charged the enemy, took 10 ships with their crews, and sunk 8. The rest of the Carthaginian ships retired to the Liparian islands. The result of this battle was that both sides concluded that they were now fairly matched. That's what we were saying before, because you have to follow Polybius' account. There's not much more. And accordingly, made more systematic efforts to secure a naval force and to dispute the supremacy at sea. While these things were going on, the land forces effected nothing worth recording, but wasted all their time in such petty operations as chanced through in their way. Therefore, after making the preparations I have mentioned for the approaching summer, the Romans, with 330 decked ships of war, touched at Messene, thence put to sea, keeping Sicily on the right. So there is the Strait of Messina, they're going south, and after doubling the headland Pachynus, passed to the Eknomos. pretty much like in the midst of the the southern Sicilian coast. And after doubling and because the land force was also in that district, the Carthaginians on their part put to sea again with 350 decked ships, touched at Lilybaeum, and thence dropped anchor at Heraclea Minoa. Pass into 26. The preparations for battle. Now, it was the purpose of the Romans to sail across to Libya and transfer the war there, in order that the Carthaginians might find the danger affecting themselves in their own country rather than Sicily. But the Carthaginians were determined to prevent this. They knew that Libya was easily invaded, and that the invaders, if they once effected a landing, would meet with little resistance from the inhabitants, and they therefore made up their minds not to allow it, and were eager rather to bring the matter to a decisive issue by a battle at sea. This was an important aspect of Carthaginian politics that, differently from Rome, that created a massively courageous Romano-Italic confederacy that barely wavered even after the massive bloodshed at Cannae. The Carthaginians were much more severed. They did not have like a sort of an integration system of the same kind that the Roman hegemony had imposed. And so the Libyans, like the Libopunic population, was not essentially to stop the Romans by itself. It was all on the shoulders of Carthage and of her rich oligarchic establishment, that it's not like they weren't much inclined to war per se, but they preferred, like at this point in the historic, making mercenaries fight for them, and if anything, using as a citizen force just essentially their navy. That was the one that were more directly invested on, just because of, again, the Carthaginians' dock capacities, the fact that they were always involved at sea, and so blocking, like in this instance, any invasion attempt at sea before it could be brought on land. So it goes on and says, and the one side was determined to cross the other to prevent their crossing, and their enthusiastic rivalry gave promise of a desperate struggle. That's how from strategy you pass to tactics in its ancillary function. As von Clausewitz says, the preparations of the Romans were made to suit either contingency, an engagement at sea, or a disembarkation on the enemy's soil. Accordingly, they picked out the best hands from the land army and divided the whole force, which they meant to take on board, into 4 divisions. Each division had alternative titles. The first was called the First Legion, or the First Squadron, and so on with the others. The fourth had a third title besides. They were called Triarii, on the analogy of land armies, and the last line, in fact, in manipular formation of 3. The total number of men thus making up the naval force amounted to nearly 140,000. This is Polybius saying, at least. Of course, we think it's less, but this is really huge. Like, however it happened, it was that massive in a relative sense. And reckoning each ship as carrying, this is the relatively controversial issue, but it's not so important. Important is the tactics they employ. The proportions also are the ones that matter when you look at the odds. Each ship carrying 300 rowers and 120 soldiers. The Carthaginians, on the other hand, made their preparations almost exclusively with a view to a naval engagement. Of course, the Romans were carrying an entire army with them. The Carthaginians weren't. And so this facilitated, even just if you wonder about the mobility, the maneuverability of the Carthaginian navy, in part, of course, was due to the fact that we're not carrying an entire army, but they still needed, of course, people to fight on board. Their numbers, if we reckon by the number of their ships, were over 150,000 men. The mere recital of these figures must, I should imagine, strike anyone with astonishment at the magnitude of the struggle and the vast resources of the contending states. Naturally, consider that Polybius writes essentially 1 century later, so we don't have to present Polybius why he was writing and for whom. We do not know his sources to begin with, so, and that's always basically the problem with ancient sources. But does it matter? It doesn't matter that much if you don't have much else to begin with. In any case, if anything, we can make another video to criticize this kind of figures, etc. But for today, let's just enjoy Polybius' account, which is still the only evidence that we have for the battle tactics. Polybius says, so yes, this is amazing. We have to take into consideration how demanding this really was. So it's an argument for, look, it's almost unbelievable how many they were. And an actual view of them itself could hardly be more impressive than the bare statement of a number of many ships, he says. And now the Romans had two facts to consider. First, that circumstances compelled them to face the open sea. And secondly, that their enemies had the advantage of fast-sailing vessels. They therefore took every precaution for keeping their line unbroken and difficult to attack. They had only 2 ships with 6 banks of oars, those namely on which the consuls Marcus Atilius and Lucius Manlius respectively were sailing. These they stationed side by side in front and in a line with each other. So here I will have inserted the image. You can see how they were deployed. This is basically the standard way we think it happened. I made the map basing myself, in fact, on Polybius' account. Also, the other reconstructions available show you the same, except, of course, we do not have an exact idea of where you will see the movement as we progress with the battle, but let's say how we know how the various sections of the array engage with one another in relation with one another. We do not exactly know where, right? So I gave sort of this position that I think to be the more orientatively plausible. So we have essentially the Roman admirals really wanted to break through with the spearhead formation and with this massive flagships that have literally to break into the Carthaginians. And this shows you how consistent that strategic principle I was talking about before was. The Romans have this bulkier, sturdier, more aggressive, and properly bloodthirsty naval forces, whereas the Carthaginians will rely more on the maneuvers, because they actually understand that they from the just learned experience of the previous year have years difficulties with the Roman Marines, and so they want essentially to crush the enemy, mostly through combined arms and or like maneuvering, rather than, here we can't talk really about arms. It's mostly like combined forces striking asymmetrically, as the Romans will actually succeed in doing. And as we'll see now, essentially refusing the center, which, as we said, we talk about this very often, especially in medieval warfare. But that's something which, that's why also this is so similar to Cannae, by the way. And it's a tactical principle that actually shows how, in this sense, that the center is weak. How who pursues this tactic is, in this strategic sense, the weaker force. Because if you had this incredibly punching forces like the Romans had, obviously it would have meant to have the advantage. Here the Carthaginians realize that they simply can't have that. You see the Roman attitude with these 2 flagships that want just to break through the enemy, as just proving the utmost also courage of these leaders. There are really something in this sense, and the Carthaginians realizing they can't sort of withstand that, and having to recur to a broader trick that, however, will not succeed, in the sense that still it will be about this strategic attrition, like this wrestling match, this iron arm confrontation, that is also very much like a locked engagement. That naval warfare in this era and for a long time to come is going to be very similar to the land one. With the only point that it's actually less maneuverable than land one. I mean, moving the ships is much more complicated than, say, moving the horses, moving the men. So most of these engagements, aside from what we will see now, from which the main battle line can be sort of asymmetric, can be broken, there can be some attempts of maneuver, things are not easy at all, and the main confrontation is just this lines of ships locked into each other, battling one another, ramming, boarding, etc., and essentially finishing eventually the enemy that breaks, that can be in that sense surrounded, simply taken out by the sheer concentration of forces that you will have maintained. So I will not digress too much on naval tactics. We have already discussed them. We will talk about them so much even more in detail. So there is no, as von Clausewitz says, it's much simpler than it seems. It's much more difficult than it seems, right? Because you have to be in the midst, again, chopping people to pieces and risking to be one of those people considered the enemy. And on the other side, that is there to do the same. That actually a battle is fought like, and so there is no magic trick or special. Like if you are an excellent commander who knows all the elements, who has the right ingredients, let's say, and make the magic that, say, Hannibal could do at Cannae, okay, that's something. And still, for example, in that case, the Roman plan was not bad at all. It was sort of putting in crisis the same Carthaginians. So always remember how closely fought, especially any larger engagement, really is. If it happens, because if it doesn't, or it happens, there isn't much of a resistance from the other side, then you realize, in fact, that there would be no reason to fight for the one who is giving up. The Battle of Cape of Ecnomus is instead very, very bloody and brutal in that regard. So, here Polybius goes on and says, behind each of these, so we're talking about the Admiral flagship, of these, the Romans station ships, the admirals, ships on one behind the other in single file, the first squadron behind the one and the second squadron behind the other. These were so arranged that as each ship came to its place, the two files diverged farther and farther from each other, the vessels being also stationed one behind the other with their prows inclining outwards. Having thus arranged the first and second squadrons in single file so as to form a wedge, they stationed the third division in a single line at its base, so that the wall finally presented the appearance of a triangle. Behind this base they stationed the horse transports. Remember, the Carthaginians didn't have it because they were not carrying any army. The Romans were. It was the invasion force of Africa. And to the rear of them they placed the fourth squadron, called the Triarii, in a single line so extended as to overlap the line in front of them at both extremities. When these dispositions were complete, the general appearance was that of a beak or wedge, the apex of which was open, the base compact and strong, while the wall was easy to work and serviceable, and at the same time difficult to break up. We'll see that the Triarii here are crucial. We're not given extra information about whether it was an actual analogy, also in terms of evidently not the composition of the single, say, maniples in the line of a legion, because they carried multiple ones. So the name is just referred to the position in the rear. But the Triarii here really have a very crucial function because they can intervene as the last reserve. If you wonder why behind the cargoes, or the ships who carried the horses, they were slower and sort of less loaded also in troops and in crews, so not so effective to fight, is to actually protect them, right? They're not really compressing them to avoid them to flee, at some point we will see that they will actually abandon them for a good reason. But so we can imagine them being relatively spaced. Here in the picture, I took myself some liberty, of course, of just guessing the distances. It's not to be taken literally. But the point is, as we'll see now, that these ships will be able to move all together from one side of the formation, outside of also this previous scheme spatial extension, right? Polybius continues. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian commanders had briefly addressed their men. They pointed out to them that victory in this battle would ensure the war in the future being confined to the question of the possession of Sicily, while if they were beaten they would have hereafter to fight for their native land and for all they held dear. With these words they passed to the word to embark. The order was obeyed with universal enthusiasm, for what had been said brought home to them the issues at stake, and they put to sea in the full fervour of excited gallantry which might well have struck terror into all who saw it. When their commanders saw the arrangement of the enemy's ships, they adapted their own to match it. 3/4 of their force was posted in a single line, extending their right wing towards the open sea with a view of outflanking their opponents and placing their ships with prows facing the enemy, while the other fourth part was posted to form a left wing of the wall, the vessels being at right angles to the others and close to the shore. The two Carthaginian commanders were Hanno and Hamilcar. The former was the general who had been defeated in the engagement at Agrigentum if you prefer. He now commanded the right wing, supported by beaked vessels for charging, and the fastest sailing quinqueremes for outflanking the enemy. The latter, who had been in the engagement of Tundaris, had charge of the left wing. This officer, occupying the central position of the entire line, on this occasion employed a stratagem, which I will now describe. The battle began by... Before we begin, this is also the final consideration before we pass to the actual sequence. You understand that the Romans, first of all, deployed their forces in a way that were optimally confident to employ. This tells you a lot about how, say, battle arrays often are not much of a matter of straight choice or option, in the sense that here you have specific strengths from your side. In presenting such compact front, for example, that you can hardly break through the to the fact that basically you have multiple lines, and that this does seem really like a Roman legion to an extent, is definitely a challenge for Carthaginians that, as we've seen, had the privilege of testing the first effective Roman seaborne capacities as them as the first, say, the host of honor. So the Romans were confident that they would break the enemy, and the Carthaginians at this point, you see here, they actually choose the the best ships, the ones for provided with spurs, etc., to break into the enemy ones, like those we try to do with them. There were different tactics that could be employed, say even a single ship. The Greeks had given the names. They weren't enormously complicated maneuvers, but they required an enormous training. All right, and here, especially the Carthaginians would have known their deal. But instead of meeting the enemy with such a, with a similar arrangement for saying try to counter them simply at that level of head-to-head clash, they opt for something that is risky from one side, this stretching their forces out, But that allows them for outflanking the enemy. That's why this battle is so similar to Cannae, because that's exactly what the Romans had set their mind on. And in saying, well, it's a good plan. And it also shows, in spite of the differences that we were saying before between land and naval tactics, that after all, a similar plan can end differently depending on the forces involved. And many other things that unfortunately also the great Polybius simply could not record. And it's already a huge deal that he wrote so much about this whole thing. Polybius goes, the battle began by the Romans charging the center of the Carthaginians, predictably enough, because they observed that it was weakened by their great extension. Exactly. And they probably, by the way, I had expected themselves such kind of deployment, because even if they had hoped, of course, like everyone does, for the enemy to make a mistake, they surely imagined that, considering such say squeezed shaped like say spearhead and in-depth array like the one would have chosen would have sparked from the Carthaginian side probably the idea of a flank attack. So it's not like the Romans were saying, okay, well, nobody will ever outflank us. Of course they knew that, and they counted still, however, they bet on being able to smash into the enemy center. That would have, at this point, like, we don't know how much they would have known about Carthaginian naval practice in this sense, but as we see here, Amilcar, of course, was in the center, so there was all a issue of honor, of morale. I mean, the admiral had just told the same Carthaginians that they were fighting for the land. What do? You put yourself in an eccentric position. Never underestimate, also from the Carthaginian side, how much they cared about individual combat championship, the sense of I'm a great warrior, also as a leader, and I have to lead, in fact, by example, etc. And also because, as we'll see now, their tactics entailed this feigned flight of some sort that requires also great skill, and so the admiral wanted to be into it, so taking responsibility for it, risking greatly, except, as we will see, after a fierce fight, admittedly, but still, he would escape. So that was also the issue again with Carthaginian admirals, apparently. No, but of course, somebody must win, and someone must lose. So the Carthaginians, Polybius says, began to retire with all speed, and the Romans pursued them with exultation. Obviously, part of this was distracting, in fact, the most punching forces from the main mass of the enemy, so splitting them and hoping to sort of target them piecemeal, having at least the chance of engaging in more or less parity clash with the rest of the Roman fleets while the most punching part was away. As we'll see, this will not work literally in terms of time. Now, Polybius says the consequence was that while the first and second Roman squadron, so the ones that made the sides of the arrow, were pressing the flying enemy, the third and fourth legions, so they were called, had become detached and were left behind. The former because they had to tow the horse transports, and the triarii because they kept their station with them and helped them to form a reserve. But when the Carthaginians thought that they had drawn the first and second squadron a sufficient distance from the main body, a signal was hoisted on board Amilcar's ship, and they all simultaneously swung their ships round and engaged their pursuers. The contest was a severe one. The Carthaginians had a great superiority in the rapidity with which they maneuvered their ships, which actually may have been yet another reason why they carried out this tactic. I mean, they wanted to tire the heavier Romans, and so trying to dilute their smashing capacity. So they would have been less winded than the Romans themselves when this coming back would have occurred. As a way to sort of smoothen the hype also from the Roman side, of the attack. And so Polybius says the Carthaginians darted out from their line and rode round the enemy. They approached them with ease and retired with dispatch, but the Romans, no less than the Carthaginians, had their reasons for entertaining hopes of victory. For when the vessels got locked together, the contest became one of sheer strength. Their engines, the crows, grappled all that once came to close quarters, and finally, both the consuls were present in person and were witnesses of their behavior in battle. We are 28. This was the state of affairs on the center, but meanwhile Hanno, with the right wing, which had held aloof when the first encounter took place, crossing the open sea, charged the ships of the Triarii and caused them great difficulty and embarrassment, while those of the Carthaginians who had been posted near the land maneuvered into line, and getting their ships straight, charged the men who were towing the horse transports. These latter let go the towing ropes, grappled with the enemy, and kept up a desperate struggle. By the way, we didn't focus too much on this Carthaginian left that, as we've seen, was placed in sort of a staggered formation towards the Sicilian coast. And so place in itself, we don't know exactly wanting to do what, because here, as you see, the Romans basically had brought their horse transports, the third line, the third squadron / legion, whatever, close to the Sicilian coast themselves. So they had actually been speedier than them. So we don't know exactly what happened, and they managed to essentially defend themselves, also because they have land behind, and so they can't quite be, say, outmaneuvered or something. I consider that they carried horses, and so they were a bit more handicapped compared to, say, the other legions. They at least they compensated with that advantage, and apparently they had been better at this than the Phoenicians, than the Carthaginians. So that Polybius says that the engagement was in 3 separate divisions, as you can see from the picture, right? Or rather, there were, Polybius says, 3 sea fights going on at wide intervals from each other. This is interesting because this was the product of the Carthaginian plan and tactics. They had willingly split forces and specifically kept, especially the Roman center, at bay for a while by luring him away for a main engagement. Now, in these 3 engagements, the opposing parties were in each case fairly matched, also for the reasons that we listed before. Polybius says, thanks to the original disposition of the ships, and therefore the victory was in each case closely contested. However, the result in the several cases was very much what was to be expected, where forces were so equal. The first to engage were the first to separate, for Hamilcar's division at last were overpowered and fled, so that the center is out. And so that's not really good news for the Carthaginians to begin with. It's essentially that's where they lost the battle, at least considering that the majority of the forces, the best, the leader, etc., were placed there. And especially, it's like the Romans win in the process, and of course they can still maneuver, etc. In fact, Polybius says, but while Lucius was engaged in securing his prizes, Marcus, observing the struggle in which the Triarii and horse transports that were involved, went with all speed to their assistance, taking with him all the ships of the second squadron, which were undamaged. The Romans did suffer consistent losses as well during the engagement, especially in this area of the battle, because that's where, again, most forces were concentrated from both sides. We're not told explicitly, but we can see how that was the case. As soon as he had reached and engaged Hanno's division, the Triarii quickly picked up courage, so they were then getting much the worst of it, and returned with renewed spirits to the fight. it was now the turn for the Carthaginians to be in difficulties. They were charged in front and on the rear, and found, to their surprise, they were being surrounded by the relieving squadron. They at once gave way and retreated in the direction of open sea. All right, and so you have here, aside from the exact disposition, you have a typical flank rear attack conducted 2 different times, because it was also difficult to coordinate everything. Then also at sea, of course, you enjoy looting the enemy ships and the general, of course, relief of victory. But this happens on both sides. In fact, Polybius says, while this was going on, Lucas was sailing back to rejoin his colleague, observed that the 3rd squadron had got wedged in by the Carthaginians close inshore. Accordingly, he and Marcus, who had by this time secured the safety of the transports and triarii, started together to relieve their imperiled comrades, who were now sustaining something very like a blockade. And the fact is that they would long before this have been utterly destroyed had not the Carthaginians been afraid of the crowds. So of the fact that the Romans would have boarded them with greater ease, apparently, and confined themselves to surrounding and penning them in close to land without attempting to charge for fear of being caught by the grappling irons. So of course, again, as we were saying before, the 3rd line had thought better to align with the coast and having, in fact, its back covered by it, so that the Carthaginians could, yes, sort of besiege them, but not completely surround them. And even though they were also carrying horses, there were, you see, the triarii, for example, were apparently all like fighting force, and or at least they were. We do not know actually the numbers, but they would have been maybe in fact less, right, even than the larger force there. We don't really know, because at least the larger force would have been, in terms of ships, however, loaded with more burden. And instead, here, the thing resolves itself with the Romans, of course, attacking en masse, regrouping all their forces. Here I didn't show it, but it's not that much of a deal. I could also actually create the picture, but it's obvious. Like once the enemy, say the main forces of the enemy were broken, and now you had different Roman forces that could regroup, concentrating just under a single chunk of the force. They were done for, right? And so Polybius says, the consuls came up rapidly and surrounding the Carthaginians captured 50 of their ships with their crews, while some few of them managed to slip away and engage by keeping close to the shore. Such was the result of the separate engagements, but the general upshot of the world battle was in favor of the Romans. 24 of their vessels were destroyed, over 30 of the Carthaginians. Not a single Roman ship was captured with its crew. 64 of the Carthaginians were so taken. Right? This is the actual story of the engagement. The rest continues with the siege of Aspis. So the Romans go to Africa, and so there is also the episode of, we'll see now, of Regulus, but mostly following still the naval side of the story. So what can we say? Like here the losses are enumerated. We think that most Punic losses were taken from Hamilcar's center. The 50 captured, of the 64 captured vessels, 50 were the ships of the Carthaginian left, apparently. So, because we know that had began the battle with a force of roughly 80 ships. There was, by the way, no other Carthaginian attempt to contest the Roman victory at sea, so that the Roman invasion force did land straight in Africa. and so seemingly neutralizing, suppressing the Punic fleet for a time. You have to imagine also manpower having to be redirected to the land forces in defense of their homeland. But as we said before, also the Romans had brought all those troops on land, so the point was not much like the sea anymore. It was actually the siege of Carthage. That is very much connected with, as you know, the work of the Spartan mercenary general Xanthippus, who actually did not bring any special, insight or Spartan wisdom to the. Who was just, one of the many sort of mercenary commanders for a hire that basically framed well the Carthaginian militia and knew how to exploit the overconfidence and ambition of the Roman consul in Africa, that was Regulus, famously resulting in the defeat of the Roman forces, disastrously so. And this actually made, like, if the Romans had won here, as we were saying in the beginning, the first and possibly even other Punic wars would have been over, right? Instead, not just the Carthaginians win, but the Roman remnants are confined to their base at Aspis. And so, what do the Carthaginians do to come back to the fleet? They manned 200 ships for the following year. The consuls for 255, there are Aemilius and Fulvius, we'll see it in other videos, launch a relief fleet of 350 ships, and these are massive naval forces, if they were actually put at sea, which decisively crushed the numerically inferior Punic fleet, so capturing 114 prizes and rescuing the survivors of the invasion force. However, upon returning triumphantly, having solidified their command of the sea and ready for other operations, the consuls sailed along the rocky southern coast of Sicily in the autumn, heedless of the warnings from their experienced seamen, and encountered a storm. And so the Romans end up being shattered onto the rocks, losing 284 of a total of 364 ships, which, if we count Polybius' estimates, would have brought to essentially the loss of 60,000 men in the wreckage. Now, again, these numbers are implausible in many ways. Nevertheless, the essentials about the size of the forces, what was invested here just in order to carry out these massive operations, is the most important part of the story, and it is actually plausible. It shows you actually how risky it was to fight at sea. Additionally, like to the, of course, the strictly military enterprise, and how, of course, strategy could be reversed to the point that you had to consider things like, sending an army back overseas a fleet to save the army overseas, and doing so with enormous expenses. And so this is all something that projects Rome, first of all, to a completely different level of military engagement and involvement, because not only there is this naval warfare that they start mastering pretty well, and that's actually the ultimate take away from this, that Rome behaved clamorously well against Carthage at sea for being essentially people landlubbers, and that in fact entailed also an involvement in the broader Mediterranean, the truly newest thing in a broader, instead political and also moral and cultural fashion. Carthage had really been such a powerfully dominant maritime force for a very long time. As you know, the Romans and the Carthaginians had originally been allies, and we'll see that in other videos explaining how old actually the Romano-Punic relations were and how they had largely been positive. as a matter of fact, up to, in fact, when Rome began to look at Sicily with lust. There is, of course, so much more to say about this page of broader Roman history. So we will see that definitely in the manualistic or Roman history videos. What we observe today is just this, aside from the ups and downs of the general strategic situation, the incredible Roman capacity against the Carthaginians. And again, proving what we were saying before, that the Romans were actually already as advanced as the Carthaginians. There's a broader point, again, it's not measured in catapults that actually were first used by the Romans, by Hellenic engineers, admittedly, and then mostly developed by, again, within the Hellenistic world, including, in many ways, the same Carthaginians that were, of course, not like a Macedonian byproduct, but they had, like the present of Xanthippus, for example, it was a Spartan, but in times in which Sparta was not much of a strong power anymore. The Roman superiority at sea, reflecting the actual Roman technological, at most, at minimum, parity, at most very greater, already by this point. And this is something that people have a bit of issues, again, picturing, in the sense that, again, they think, for example, that primitive people are more primitive people than another, depending on what you mean. I mean, the Carthaginians were not this, incredibly sophisticated, modernistic, I don't know, degenerate system. They were also, like the Western Mediterranean overall, was much more brutal and primitive to some extent. Here the Romans display already a massive civilizational capacity that the same Romans would sort of mask later to prove the fact that, oh, look, we came out of nowhere and we managed to beat the Carthaginians at sea, the Macedons on land. But we tend to underestimate how civilized, in a truly traditional sense, the Romano-Italic Confederacy already was at this point, and how well blended, in fact, tradition and modernity were for the utmost success of this culture. I think that it's difficult to unsee it. It's difficult to especially not picture what a massive leap forward the First Punic War represents for Rome. In ways that, of course, open to, in fact, also some ascendant dynamics in other fields, but made videos about the Third Punic War, as a matter of fact. So better this Roman decision to simply wipe out Carthage from the face of the earth, with a mentality that, if you study about that mid-2nd century BC, so a century afterwards, admittedly after all these ferocious wars against the same Carthage, and especially the second that had been really bloody for Rome, had quite loaded her with revenge. But how sort of, first of all, ruthless Rome was, how much they found scruples practically useless, humanitarian, or this, I don't even know how to define it, sense that is definitely not very helpful in a civilization, and how much they were, in fact, still extremely, the Romans were still extremely distrustful, and also in that case, rightfully so, towards Hellenistic culture as a whole. Because the First Punic War is what opens Rome to Hellenistic culture in many ways. it's a gradual opening, right? It's not enormous, but of course there had been lots of context before, and we'll see it also with Pyrrhus, because allegedly the Romans would have learned also in there to build camps the way at least the most updated Hellenistic version that Pyrrhus had possibly implemented himself is concerned. But it's also a bit this later Roman taste of the antiquarian taste from one side, but also a bit of a mythological one concerning their role as innovators. Look, we improved essentially what others did and we triumphed over them. Yes, in a sense it is true. They did that, but it did not pass merely through what those peoples thought that they were necessarily better for. Like in this case, I don't know, technology. That's something paradoxically the Romans had started thinking, or in part at least, because of the Greeks. And it actually has not much to do with how things practically happen. So once you see, I spent a lot of time talking about this because these wars are some of the most important ones in the history of mankind. Especially the Second Punic War is, I think, if you have to study any war in the history, study that. If you have to do it once in your life, in a truly serious sense from all sources available, the entire war, all the campaigns, all the battles, because it is the most politically, strategically, and tactically complete. There is everything into it at utmost perfection, right? And it's literally insane. And of course, Polybius remains the greatest narrator of it with an incredible insight. The main issue, though, is realizing that sometimes these wars are so important that are popularized in the wrong ways. Meaning that if, say, I'm an average person, never heard of these kind of Roman attitudes of what they were, why they had them, when they came up in history, you can basically have a completely distorted and essentially inaccurate view of Roman history, and one also of other peoples, without thinking that there is even a beyond, right? You will be, of course, this is typical, like if you know just something you will, and not something else, you will probably also not even know that else exists. So you will stop to that and to some standards that you decide by yourself being satisfactory and actually being not. Nevertheless, it was important to have addressed the topic. We should do this more often. As I was saying, I'm preparing more stuff about in certain chapters, at least of ancient warfare, that we haven't dealt with in particular detail. Again, next video in line, besides some specialist Parthian warfare, then we have something about Pyrrhus. Then I'm preparing a lot about manipular warfare and telling you that, at least explaining the genesis of manipular warfare. I think is one of the most important topics ever. That's another topic that everybody gets wrong for some reason. And again, we have definitely no problem of topic choice at the end of the day. There is always a magnificent amount of historical stuff to harvest, and really you have no idea how many videos I already prepared. I'm going through some sort of strange time in my life because I have stuff to do, and I have the time for Schwerpunkt, but with the head sometimes I'm somewhere else, and Schwerpunkt actually stabilizes it. You have actually pretty interesting topics incoming. They're not in the immediate future, but in the following weeks, oh boy, there is really pretty good, damn good stuff. Yep. Yeah. We're going to bring, like, Schwerpunkt in many ways, as you know, depends on you, right? I will be extremely honest about this. So what we're doing here has a great deal of meaning for lots of aspects involved, and what the channel does is truly what lots of other things can be done. So I count on you. There are splendid videos ahead. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.